US President Donald Trump is at it again. After a successful flash invasion of Venezuela that resulted in the capture of the country's former president Nicolas Maduro, Trump has started to beat the Greenland drum. He's done this before. Trump and his administration contend that they need Greenland as a matter of national security. Could an invasion be in the offing? If it is, then the US could be in for a rude awakening. Invading Greenland would be a catastrophic mistake for the US, potentially ending in a disaster for both the country's military and the entire standing of NATO in the process. The very idea that the United States could take Greenland seems preposterous at first glance. The island, although part of the North American continent, is considered part of Europe. Specifically, it's owned by the Kingdom of Denmark, though Denmark gives Greenlanders wide-ranging autonomy to essentially run themselves. Of course, Denmark is an ally of the US, with both nations being part of NATO. Plus, those in Greenland don't want any sort of US control. As CNBC reports, polls taken on the island, which has a population of about 57,000 people, show that most Greenlanders categorically state that they don't want the US to roll in and take over. That's not necessarily to say that Greenlanders are content with Danish control either. Some in the territory want Greenland to be 100% independent, as explained by pro-independence member of parliament Aya Chemnitz, who says, "For many years, the majority of Greenlanders have been fighting for our right to represent ourselves. We say nothing about us without us, and that's why it's important for us to still fight for making sure that we have even more autonomy in time to come." So a continued ownership of Greenland by Denmark is already contentious. However, the idea of the US taking over seems to be a near-definitive no. But none of this seems to be stopping Trump and his rhetoric. As the BBC reports, Trump contends that Greenland not being under US control means that the island represents a vulnerability that could be exploited by traditional US enemies such as China and Russia. Speaking in the real estate terms that he knows best, Trump says, "Countries have to have ownership. You defend ownership. You don't defend leases. And we'll have to defend Greenland." Trump also claims that the US will take Greenland the easy way, which appears to be Denmark agreeing to hand the island over, or the hard way. Could that mean a direct invasion? The White House isn't saying. What Trump is saying is that the current situation in Greenland, where the US maintains a military base staffed by over 100 personnel, isn't good enough. Countries can't make 9-year deals or even 100-year deals, Trump claims. He also added, "I love the people of China. I love the people of Russia, but I don't want them as our neighbor in Greenland. Not going to happen. And by the way, NATO's got to understand that." For Trump, it's all about ownership. And with that ownership comes the ability for the US to do whatever it wants in Greenland. Sky News expands on this, noting that there are more specific reasons why the US desires outright control of the island. The outlet points out that Greenland's position in the Arctic Circle is important, as the shortest distance between Russia and the US tracks over Greenland. Presumably, this ignores the Bering Strait that separates Russia's Far East from Alaska, presumably because the freezing cold temperatures in those regions make the strait less of a threat for the US than potential passage over Greenland. And that passage matters because Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles would likely travel over Greenland to reach America's east coast. The US wants to be able to set up early warning systems to ensure it knows if this ever happens. It also just so happens that Greenland could play an important role in the emerging Northern Sea Route and Northwest Passage. The US wants to ensure freedom of passage, at least for its own trading ships and those of its allies, via these routes, and control over Greenland could make that possible. Oh, and Greenland has a lot of oil and gas. 50 billion barrels of oil and gas, according to Sky News, along with a host of valuable mineral assets, including uranium. But it's not like the Trump administration has shown much of an interest in taking over other countries' oil, gas, and mineral wealth. Well, unless you ignore Trump's statements noting oil as a big motivator for the capture of Maduro, to the point where he has requested that America's oil companies invest $100 billion in the country. Or how the current administration has wrangled a minerals deal with Ukraine that will allow the US to profit from Ukraine's vast mineral reserves, albeit under the guise of a reinvestment fund designed to rebuild the country in the wake of the Ukraine war. Sarcasm aside, it does seem that defense concerns drive Trump and his administration, with oil, gas, and minerals being a secondary benefit due to how difficult they are to access in Greenland's unforgiving terrain. Still, the main point here is that the US wants Greenland, and Trump has implied that he's willing to go beyond merely asking for the island if the situation calls for it. In other words, an invasion might be possible. But it's not an invasion that's guaranteed to go well for the US. That doesn't seem the case on the surface, as there are several things that play in the US's favor when it comes to an invasion of Greenland. Taking the island shouldn't be a problem at all due to the sheer amount of force that the US could bring to bear against a much weaker Danish military. As Global Firepower points out, the US defeats Denmark in every major metric barring perhaps geography. We'll come back to geography in a moment. In terms of military strength, the US has 1.328 million active personnel in its military, along with 799,500 reserves. Denmark only has 20,000 active soldiers and 12,000 reserves, the majority of whom aren't stationed on Greenland. The US spends over 100 times more than Denmark on its military, hitting almost $900 billion per year. It has 13,043 aircraft versus Denmark's 117, and 440 warships compared to Denmark's 50. And should the US manage to establish a position on Greenland, it has thousands more tanks and hundreds of thousands more armored vehicles in its stockpiles that it could bring to bear. Frankly, any initial fight between Denmark and the US would be a whitewash. Denmark also can't necessarily rely on NATO's Article 5 to come to its rescue if the US invades. For a start, there's the complication of both Denmark and the US being part of NATO, meaning an invasion of Greenland would create the unprecedented situation of one NATO ally invading the territory of another. That alone would create confusion among the alliance. But even if we assume that every other NATO member opposes the US taking Greenland by force, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will stand and fight alongside Denmark. Article 5, even when triggered, isn't a guarantee that all allies provide an armed response to a threat. As NATO itself says, all allies are obligated to come to the assistance of the ally that triggers Article 5, though the nature of that assistance can vary. This assistance may or may not involve the use of armed force and can include any action that allies deem necessary to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area, NATO says. The words "deem necessary" are the important ones here, as many NATO members may prefer to stay out of the Greenland conflict, as much as they possibly can, for fear of angering the US and perhaps setting Trump's sights on them next. So the door is open for the US to launch a flash invasion. And in an analysis of what that invasion might look like, military commentator Wes O'Donnell says that the US certainly has the ability to move fast and scale quickly in an assault on the island. O'Donnell suggests that the US would use its overwhelming air superiority to take key nodes in Greenland, with those nodes including anything that could serve a military purpose. Think ports, airfields, communication centers, fuel and infrastructure and the like. That Caesar package, as O'Donnell dubs it, would be far too strong for Denmark to resist during the initial invasion. It likely starts with Joint Special Operations Command Assault Elements, O'Donnell says. Such assaults would likely include the 75th Ranger Regiment, which has historically been used to seize airfields. They kick the door in, secure the runway, establish perimeter control, and buy time for the next wave, O'Donnell says. Follow-on infantry would have to arrive quickly, allowing the US to establish a ground presence in Greenland. That presence needs to be sizable, as the US will be more focused on capturing nodes than it is on killing an enemy, with the goal being to hold those nodes long enough to enable the US to bring political pressure to bear on Denmark. The message would be simple. We've taken the island's key nodes already, so Denmark may as well hand it over rather than hurting itself by trying to fight back. It all sounds like an easy enough job for the US and its enormous military. Greenland's key nodes, as O'Donnell calls them, could be taken in a matter of weeks, and there isn't a whole lot that Denmark could do about it in a direct fight. But that's the problem the US may not have anticipated. It wouldn't be dealing with a direct fight. What it would face is a series of issues that, when combined, could turn the taking of Greenland into a long-term disaster. Let's start with the aircraft that would be inevitably needed if the US is to take an island that travel math places somewhere in the region of 4,913 kilometers or around 3,053 miles away from the US. The numbers vary depending on where in the US the measurement is taken, but that isn't a small distance, and O'Donnell points to the need to traverse the ocean to get to Greenland as a major obstacle for the US and its air force. You need more fixed-wing airlift because everything is far and heavy, the military commentator says when comparing a potential Greenland aerial operation to what the US recently pulled off in Venezuela. That means more C-17s and C-130 aircraft for transporting troops and cargo. America's fighter jets will also need to help to bring their power to bear on Greenland. You need more tankers because distances and loiter time in the high north eat fuel for breakfast, O'Donnell points out. These are all issues that the US can solve, but they create complications, especially in an environment as inhospitable as Greenland. Search and rescue resources would be needed, as any mistake in the air, at sea, or on the ground could prove extremely costly, and those mistakes are more likely to happen when operating on an island with a mean temperature of 42 degrees Fahrenheit or 5.6 degrees Celsius. That brings us nicely to the geography problem. Greenland is cold, but it's not just the temperatures that would create challenges for the US in an invasion. Greenland is huge, with a total area of about 2.16 million square kilometers, or around 836,330 square miles, when including offshore islands, and almost 80% of that territory is covered by an enormous ice cap. That's a lot of territory to cover, even by an invading military focused on taking the nodes we discussed earlier. And those nodes aren't exactly close to one another. The few deep-sea ports and airfields that exist on Greenland are spread out, which only adds to the geographical challenge of assaulting the island. Throw the cold back into play and you get weather that causes equipment to break, logistics to break down, and unprepared soldiers to freeze. East Greenland is also a problem. Gusty is perhaps the best word to describe the eastern region of the island, and there will be times when the gust changes into a rip-roaring wind that blankets troops and equipment with snow. Visit Greenland explains, pointing out that katabatic wind systems, which it dubs Pitterak, can cause the eastern region's winds to go from calm to speeds of 324 kilometers or about 201 miles per hour. It doesn't matter how big your military is when this combination of geography and weather is wreaking havoc on equipment. Malfunctions will be common. Winds could turn what would otherwise be fairly routine operations into nightmares, and with the cold comes the hardening of rubber, thickening of lubricants, and fogging of optics, all of which make it so even the best-laid plans get shattered in an instant. Greenland itself would influence the tempo and perhaps even the success of America's operations, and that could mean that an attempted flash invasion will be far slower than the US anticipates. Then there's the fact that Denmark would put up something of a fight. It certainly won't go toe-to-toe with the US for the reasons we mentioned. With its greater knowledge of Greenland's geography to back it, Denmark could do a lot to deny US control over the island, even though it can't defeat the US in a straight fight. And according to O'Donnell, Denmark's most likely course of action might be to form an alliance with other Nordic countries. With confusion in NATO about how to respond, an ad hoc Nordic coalition, perhaps including Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, could arise. They would form this coalition outside of NATO command, frame it as a collective self-defense in support of Denmark and Greenland's elected government, O'Donnell states. Suddenly, the US goes from fighting against one country to fighting against four in O'Donnell's scenario. But conquest wouldn't be the coalition's goal. The goal would be denial, not conquest, O'Donnell adds. Prevent a clean lodgment, disrupt reinforcements, raise the cost until Washington backs down or negotiates. That turns Greenland into a contest about access, logistics, and legitimacy. We've seen something similar to this play out in Ukraine, albeit with far more bloodshed than O'Donnell's proposed Nordic coalition would want to experience. Ukraine's tactic against Russia, especially since it developed long-range strike capability, is to slow Russia on the ground while slowly wearing it down economically and militarily with its long-range strikes. Between January and August 2025, Ukraine's long-range strikes had cost Russia $74.1 billion. Now, the Nordic coalition wouldn't be hitting the US, that's unfeasible. However, the coalition does have enough military assets to make life very difficult for the US that won't be able to bring its full force to bear on Greenland. Sweden would be extremely valuable here for its ability to gather intelligence. According to Secure World, back in 2022, Sweden is in the top 10 of its rankings for cyber defense, information control, and surveillance. O'Donnell also notes the Swedish knack for intelligence gathering, adding that the country's S-102 aerial platform is a key asset. That platform scans for signals from navigation equipment, radar, and weapon systems, essentially giving Denmark an early warning system that it can use to anticipate US moves. Add the Saab 340, AEW, and C into the mix, and you get a whole lot of intelligence being gathered by one nation that could be used by the entire coalition. O'Donnell lays out a multi-layered aerial defense conducted by the Nordic coalition that could cause problems for the US. In this defense strategy, Sweden would deploy its S-102s and Saab 340s over the Baltic region and southern Scandinavia at first. That would free up Denmark to focus on Greenland. Sweden would also provide Gripen fighter jets to aid in air policing and rapid response. Those jets open up regional defense missions that, when combined with ground-based air defenses at key nodes, make it far harder for the US to capture those nodes than it might anticipate. In other words, the Nordic coalition would keep Denmark's logistics safe and running as Denmark and its allies focus on making the setting up of logistics difficult for the US. Again, remember that Greenland is an island. For the US to conquer, it needs to establish safe through lines for troops and equipment. The denial of the creation of those through lines wouldn't mean that Denmark and its Nordic allies defeat the US. But they would slow the US effort down, which adds up to more time, money, and political will spent. There's also the sea battle to take into consideration. The US would want to station aircraft carriers around Greenland, thus making its airstrikes easier to pull off, and would also want to use its ships to transport troops and equipment. It's through the establishment of a naval backbone that the US invasion of Greenland will go from being a raid, as conducted via airstrikes, to a full-blown campaign designed to take control, O'Donnell says. The US needs sea lines to maintain durable control. Denmark and any allies that it can muster would be disrupting those sea lines every step of the way. That disruption wouldn't be easy, as the US brings submarines, carrier strike groups, and amphibious forces to the fight. This attacking force would be needed to enable logistics ships to sail into Greenland. Denmark isn't going to defeat America's navies, even with its allies, but what it can do is disrupt the lines of supply that the US needs to create. The serious patrol will be key here. According to the BBC, this patrol has existed since the Cold War era, and it involves 6 dog sled teams, each manned by 2 soldiers from the Danish Royal Navy, that spend 6 months of every year patrolling an area of Greenland that measures 160,000 square kilometers or 60,000 square miles. The mention of dog sled teams sounds almost quaint, but the members of this patrol are special forces operatives who understand Greenland's cold weather conditions perhaps better than anybody else. The Sirius patrol likely already has caches set up throughout Greenland on which it can survive as it travels. It knows where the island's fuel depots are, where its power units lie. Rather than attacking the US forces, this patrol will work in secret, sabotaging the nodes that the US relies on for logistics after it's landed its forces on Greenland. Again, it's not about beating the US, it's about making the Greenland invasion such a slog that it starts to look like far more trouble than it's worth. The headline is the sustainment math, O'Donnell points out. How many days of supplies can you push through in winter? How many sorties can you generate in Arctic weather? How many tankers do you have available? And how many can you spare from other global commitments? Commentator adds. The last point is especially important, as the US having a massive military doesn't mean it would deploy all of that military to Greenland. It can't unless it wants to leave itself and its approximately 750 military bases around the world unmanned. If Denmark can hold out long enough, the US invasion of Greenland becomes a battle of attrition. Not one of troops and equipment, necessarily, but one that drains times and political will, all while giving the US longer and longer to damage its relationships with its other NATO allies. Would the US be willing to allow those relationships to crumble in return for taking Greenland? That's the big question, and it's one that Greenland's defenders would try to force the US to answer if Trump follows through on his threats. But right now, the US may have turned its focus to other potential targets. Iran is a hot-button issue, and Trump has been vocal in his support for the protesting civilians in that country who want to topple the ruling regime. The US may be on the verge of making a decision to end that regime once and for all, and Russia could be next on the agenda if it does. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the US's latest moves in the Greenland situation. And thank you for watching.